All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for logging on. We are going to get started. My name is Elise. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications here at Fluence. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar presented by Casey Rivero. Today, we'll be giving a short presentation on the topic of DLI, or Daily Light Integral, as it relates to cannabis production, followed by an interactive question and answer session. Please take a look at the bottom of your screen. You'll find a Q&A button that Zoom provides. I invite you to ask your questions throughout the presentation through this function, and we will answer the questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Casey. Casey has spent more than 2 decades in the horticulture space. His experience as Director of Cultivation at a grow in Oregon further elevates his intimate knowledge of lighting, nutrients, soil, software, and HVAC. Casey also lives to educate and utilizes a commercial design approach when creating a customer solution for any need. Here at Fluence, Casey serves as a cannabis solution architect on the business development team. He works with the entire organization on cannabis industry knowledge and experience. Not only does he integrate with our customer success, which you'll see today, he also aids in the education and training of our staff. Throughout the year, you can find him teaching various workshops or giving presentations, now of course digitally, around the world. And with that, I will hand over this presentation to Casey.
Awesome, thank you, Elise, and welcome everybody. It's kind of the quarantine edition to the Fluence webinar series here, and I hope you get something out of it, enjoy it. So through this presentation, as Elise said, we're going to be discussing the benefits of utilizing DLI and how to maximize that within your growth and production. And we'll go through some key benefits as well as what actually DLI is and how to use that and utilize those approaches to produce better and more consistent crops. We're going to show you a couple case studies as well as benefits and takeaways from this webinar that you can go back to your own farms and gardens and look at to optimize your DLI levels. So a couple key benefits of maximizing DLI within your production. Obviously, the first one is increased production, right? Next one being decreased cycle time, minimizing how long it takes to harvest, improved quality and consistency, as well as increased potency. And why do we do this? To maximize our profits by maximizing our harvest, correct? So what is DLI? First, to understand what DLI is, we need to understand the components at which what DLI is composed of. So the first one is PAR, and PAR is photosynthetic active radiation. And PAR is the wavelength of light that is within the range of 400 to 700 nanometers. And this drives photosynthesis. So PAR is a widely used, but often misused term that is related to horticulture lighting. So PAR is not a measurement like feet or inches or kilos, but rather it defines the type of light that is needed to support photosynthesis. So next step is, what is PPFD? PPFD is photosynthetic photon flux density, and we measure this in what's called micromoles per square meter per second. And PPFD measures the amount of PAR that is actually arriving at the plant, or as some might say, the number of photosynthetically active photons that fall on a given surface each second. So PPFD is a spot measurement of a specific location within your canopy, and it's measured, like we said again, in micromoles per square meter per second. So now what's the difference between PPFD and DLI? As we stated, PPFD is the measurement of photon density at a single point in time, whereas DLI is a measurement of the photon density over a period of time. So 24-hour period of time gives us our DLI level. This leads us to the calculation of actually what daily light integral is. And this is the total number of photons of PAR accumulated over a given area in a 24-hour period, like we were saying. So we take the PPFD, otherwise known as the micromoles per square meter per second, and we multiply this by 60 minutes, which is 1 hour. Then we multiply that by 60 seconds, which equals 1 minute, and we multiply that then by the photo period. So how many hours is your plant actually needed? So whether it's a vegetative, it will be 1 value. Whether it's a bloom number, it will be 1 value. And then we divide this over 1 million micromoles per mole. So now how is the plant responding? plants respond to the light in two main ways. So in a production setting, growth and development are the two main functions of light. And the first two interactions we have consist of light quantity, which is the intensity, and light quality, which is the spectrum. And these represent the proponent for plant growth. And the light quantity being the plant biomass, so how much actual plant mass is being produced by the light. The light quality being spectrum promote the morphology, so how the plant structure is actually being developed within this phase. The next two interactions we have are the light quality or spectrum combined with the light duration or photoperiod, so how many hours per day is actually producing this plant. And this is responded to the plant development, right? So we talked about the morphology, how the plant is growing, but then it's also responsible for the flowering phase, right? As well as the pollination phase if you're growing male plants. So how does the plant utilize this light? First, we need to understand the difference between plant growth and plant development. So plant growth is an irreversible increase in the size of the plant, and it's also a function of how much biomass is being produced and driven by that photosynthesis. The next, like I said, is plant development. And this is a process by which the plant's organs, or leaves, stems, flowers, are originating and maturing. And so both plant growth and development occur during the three different phases of growth within the plant's life. The establishment growth is the first phase, and this occurs after seed germination or while you're rooting and established cutting. So your seed germination phase as well as your cloning phase equaling your establishment growth phase. Next, the plant moves into the vegetative growth phase, and this occurs when the leaves and stems are rapidly growing and your plant is actually producing the mass that it needs to create a stable plant for your flowering phase. And the final and last phase of the plant's growth is the reproductive growth phase. And this occurs as the plants transition to produce flowers, pollen, and actual fruit, right? So you may be asking, how is the plant using this light? So photons of light are actually used as the reaction driver, right? And these react with carbon dioxide, water, mineral, and nutrients as the reaction inputs. And when all three of these forces combine, the plant then produces and releases oxygen and carbohydrates, right? So then what's happening below the surface, right? What about the root system? As the plants are receiving more light intensity, they're also receiving more radiative energy from either that light fixture or for the sun. And this causes transpiration, which is the evaporation of water from the leaves. And this happens through the transpiration stream, which is actually the movement of water through that plant, right? So the roots absorb the water and mineral and nutrients, and it transports it through the plant, which is eventually released through the leaves, right? Called transpiration. So now how do we know how much light is too much light, right? There's what we call a light saturation point, and this light saturation point is very important. And so we said a minute ago that light or photons were the reaction driver, and that CO2 was another key reaction input to this. So light saturation will normally occur when some other factor, usually CO2, is limited, right? And we now know that the species of cannabis has over 1,000 different cultivars. And within these 1,000 different cultivars, there's many different genetic backgrounds. And this gives us a wide range of acceptable light saturation points, but it's still usually limited by those reaction inputs being CO2 and water, mineral, nutrients, right? And so as light intensity or PPFD increases, the photosynthetic rates also increase until the light saturation point is reached. And so as you can see representative on the graph on the right, the first test that we had reached a light saturation point when we gave it 400 parts per million of CO2, as well as about a 450 ppfd light level. That's where we reached our light saturation point for that case study. The next one, we gave it a treatment of 800 parts per million of CO2 with roughly an 850 ppfd or micromoles per square meter per second, and we reached our light saturation point then. So the third and final phase, as you can see, we gave it an elevated level of CO2 at 1400 parts per million, as well as an elevated intensity of light at about 1050, and we reached a higher photosynthetic rate. So this tells us that as we increase our inputs, we are also increasing our production. And as we keep our inputs consistent, we are developing a consistent production as well. So some of you may be asking, what's the difference in calculating DLI outdoors and indoors? And is this important? Well, there is a big difference. And in a greenhouse setting, we have a baseline photon level that comes from the sun, right? So this is the tricky part, because we know that from sun up to sundown, the light levels are constantly changing. And this is due to a few factors, including the rotation of the Earth, where our longitude and latitude are, how much cloud cover there is, dust being either on the greenhouse surface itself or flying particularly through the air, and also many other hurdles that Mother Nature likes to throw at us, right? So this is why we need to supplement that natural light with artificial light to maintain an adequate and also consistent light level, no matter what season it is, no matter what time of year it is. So on the flip side, in an indoor setting, we are relying solely on that artificial lighting to produce and provide all the photons required for that plant's production, right? And so this is why we mostly just utilize the term ppfd, or micromoles per square meter per second, when relating to indoor light levels. So when the lights come on for the day, they're usually at a consistent level throughout that 12 to 18 hour period of light level, right? Now, sometimes people will recreate a 20-minute sunrise, sundown. Sometimes people experiment with nighttime interruptions, but this in an indoor setting doesn't necessarily change the DLI level as much as it would for the outdoor setting. So now, how do plants use this DLI, right? So there's a recommended optimal DLI light level for all species of plants in commercial production these days, right? So generally, agronomists have maintained a maximum DLI of about 40 for their high light requiring species of plants, as you see, like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and other flowers like chrysanthemums that require a higher optimal light level for performance, right? And so we now know that cannabis and hemp production well exceeds these numbers. And we're seeing and noticing that an optimal DLI level for cannabis or hemp flowering starts at about 30 DLI, which at a 12-hour period is roughly 800 ppfd. Now, some of you may be thinking that's extremely low. Some of you may be thinking, I have no idea what that number means, but it's a pretty general number for the amount of cannabis diversity that we have right now, as well as hemp. So obviously, throughout the life of the plant, the optimal DLI levels will change. And this depends on what phase of growth the plant is in, as well as how many hours of light are required on each day, whether it's in vegetative phase, which equals cloning, or whether it's in the flowering phase, right, which is the blooming phase. And as you can see, designated by this graph on the left, as we increase from starting point, which is a roughly 80 ppfd for the cloning, to well over 1,000 in some cases ppfd as we're maturing in our plants, that DLI level will change depending on how many hours of light are required. And as you can see designated by the graph, it ramps up until the end of the long day phase, which is the vegetative phase, and then it does the same in the flowering phase. It ramps up as we're gaining our light level. So traditionally in agriculture, we're given an average DLI set point by region. And some of you may have seen maps like this. There's maps like this for the United States. There's maps like this for South America, Europe, Asia. Scientists have come up with maps like this for locations all over the globe, right? So the challenge with this, though, is that as you see, this annual DLI map gives us an amazing accurate point, but it averages through an entire year's worth of growing, right? So for this focus and this exercise, we're going to zone on a region that we all know is a very sunny region historically, and that's Southern Nevada, or Las Vegas. Some of you have also seen monthly DLI reference data points that look like this. So this zooms in a little bit more accurate and shows us what we should expect as far as DLI average levels per month, right? And this is a little bit better than a yearly average, but still not quite the accuracy that we need, right, to produce optimal and consistent plants year round. So the main point that I'm trying to say in that is that the plants are accumulating continually and responding. They don't wait till the end of the month and average how much light they got and then grow accordingly. They're continuing to respond and react to the light levels, the CO2 levels, the environmental conditions, the nutrients in water. They are continuing to accumulate and respond, not averaging at the end of the month, right? So for this case, we look at Las Vegas, Nevada, and this information comes from 2019. So at a target DLI level of 40, like we said, which is roughly 940 ppfd, as you can see designated by the red and the green colors, we are below our target DLI level for 8 months out of the entire year, with a close call being in May and August at 40 and 41 DLI, right? So this says that at almost 85% of the year, we will need some kind of supplemental lighting to maintain our required 40 DLI level. And again, this is in Las Vegas, Nevada, where we see a lot of sun, right? So now let's take a closer look at 2 different months. We chose the best month out of the year, or one of the best months out of the year for light intensity, which is July, and the worst month out of the year for light intensity, which is December. And as you can see, even in one of the best months out of the year, we still have a week's worth of below adequate light level, right? So 1 week out of the entire month, we need to make up for that light level, right? This is a big, big portion of that growth period for that entire month. And as you can see in December, we don't even come close to hitting that light level throughout the entire month. So looking at this all together, you kind of get a chance to see the inconsistencies throughout the year when it comes to light intensity, right? And so this graph represents the entire year. Each of those lines is a day. And so as you can see, that blue line represents our target DLI, which in this exercise, like I said, was 40 DLI, which is roughly 940 ppfd at a 12-hour light day. So you can see moving from January to December, we have many, many days here where we're gonna have to supplement our light, and a few days that go above and beyond to maintain our consistency. So now what we need to do is break this down into a more granular level, right? Like I said, plants are not averaging by the end of the month. They are continuing to accumulate, right? So let's look at the daily light levels and consistencies. And in this inconsistency, is shown heavily when zoomed into each day, right? On the left, we have a week of obviously low light levels represented in December, right? But on the right, which is July, one of the best months of the year for light intensity, this graph shows many inconsistencies in the daily light levels throughout that day, right? So in this case, where we have a daily DLI average, right, that exceeds our target, it might have only been for a few hours in which the rest of the day, the light level was inadequate. So your plant is responding to those lower light levels and then reacting to it in its production. So as you can see, as we dive into a more granular level and granular view of what's happening in the consistencies of the light, we see there are actually many inconsistencies in the light throughout a day, right? As opposed to what we see as an average. So we got the pleasure to work with a group out of California called Outco. And we did a study with them where we implemented 4 different levels of light treatment. We kept the CO2 concentration consistent at about 1500. The relative humidity stayed pretty consistent at about 52, as well as the average temperature being about 23 Celsius, right? So what we saw was that as we increased our light level from 400 to 600, 600 to 800, 800 to 1200, we were able to see that increase in grams per square foot of production based on the light level intensity changes. So from 400 to 600, we saw an increase in 50% production, right? And again, this is dried grams per square foot. From 600 to 800 ppfd, we noticed a 27% increase in production. And then moving from 800 to 1200, which 1200 was the highest light level that we gave them for a treatment in this experiment, we saw a 9% increase. So what does this show? This is giving us our light saturation curve. Could we have added a 1500 ppfd and seen another increase? Probably, that's what this graph showed us, but it would have been smaller and we might have had to elevate our CO2 as well as our feed schedule. But right now, this shows us that as we increase the light intensity, we're also increasing the plant yield. And you can check out more about that case study on our website. There's a link here on the screen, as well as we can share a link later. But there's a lot more great information. There's also many other studies. There's another study done by James Eves out of Quebec, as well as Paul Kusuma from USU. And they showed equally, if not higher, increased results when higher densities of photons were applied to these canopies. All right. So before I briefly explain the benefits of maximizing DLI, but we'll go through those right now. So the first one, like I said, was increased production. And this is due to maintaining optimal light intensities throughout the entire growth phase. Next one is decreasing cycle time. And this is by driving the photosynthesis at a more rapid and optimal rate. The next is improving quality and consistency of our product. And this is achieved by maintaining a stable growing environment each and every cycle, right? That way, every production run equals a consistent harvest as the last. And last but not least, especially in cannabis, is increased potency. And we're achieving this by driving those secondary metabolites within our production continually, which equals increased profit, right? Which, as well as if we're producing cannabis for commercial production, increased profit is always a great thing. So you may be asking, this is great, Casey, but what do I do next, right? How do I take this information and apply it to my own cultivation facility, right? So the first step is to evaluate your current lighting strategy. And what this means is look at your business model and evaluate, am I achieving the light intensity, the light consistency and requirements for the product that I am trying to grow, whether it's indoor, whether it's greenhouse, whether you're producing for quality flowers, or whether you're producing for extracts. Understand your strategy and then evaluate your current lighting strategy based on that. Next important step after you're understanding what you're trying to achieve is to essentially buy a meter and check the light intensity, but as well as the consistency throughout the entire canopy. And there's a lot of light meters on the market, and it's like with any tool, you pay for what you get. There's some cheaper tools, but as long as they're accurate and you know the difference between the real light level and that, you can get away with it. I prefer either the Apogee tools or the Lightcore tools. They remain a little bit more consistent, a little bit more accurate, right? And then test everything. Test every type of genetic that you have, test throughout your facility, test, and write it down. Then the next step that I recommend is to run trials. And running trials with your own genetics is the very important thing. Like we talked about, there's an extreme high amount of genetic diversity within cannabis, right? And so what works for my sour diesel might work completely different for your sour diesel or for your Blue Dream or for your Purple Punch, right? And so running trials with your own genetics to understand how the light levels are affecting your crops is a very important thing. And then record all that data. And then last but not least, the final step, seek advice from lighting professionals like Fluence, right? And this gives you the chance to evaluate either your current plan or your future plan and understand if the lighting requirements are going to meet your goals and actually give you success within this. So I appreciate everyone tuning in, and thank you very much, and I think this is collecting some questions.
Thank you, Casey. We do have quite a few questions coming in, and so I'm going to try to organize the questions based on the content, from DLI to plant growth to research to availability of this study and next steps. So let's get started and dive in. For those of you listening in, feel free to continue to ask those open questions in the question section below. But let's get started. So just talking about DLI, can you please, Casey, just point out the resources available? So I have a few people asking, where do I see my DLI if I'm in New York or if I'm out of the country? And, one person had asked that they have the study from Utah, but you see a little bit more data in your presentation here. So let's talk about the data sources, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. There's a lot of data sources, and honestly, I hate to say this as a cliche, but if you Google it, there's a lot of reference points done by academia and science right now that will point you into kind of more generalized, but also you can look up some regional DLI levels. Dr. Faust has been heavily involved in creating DLI maps that you can just go download and point at where you want the DLI levels, and it will give you those average DLI levels. Also looking into more studies similar to the studies that I was mentioning earlier, are a very important thing, from James Eaves as well as Paul Kusama. So essentially, between Faust, Eaves, and Kusama, you'll find a lot of regional information. We at Fluence have developed some pretty intense tools that can dive into a more granular approach at discovering average DLI levels down to the daily level. And that's how I got kind of that data earlier that I was showing you through Las Vegas. And so the more granular we can get on your DLI levels, the more accurate and consistent your light levels will actually be, and the more success you will achieve once you actually implement that into your production.
Great, thank you, Casey. And one area that I'll talk about is we do have an article on our science page on our website called Understanding DLI. There are links within this blog post in the science article that can point you to some of these studies, as well as a location to check out your location wherever you are. If you're in South Africa, if you're in Spain, if you're in New York or on the West Coast, you can take a look at those studies there. And what we'll do for the audience here is in that follow-up email, we'll provide you some of these links so that you can do some further research. Okay, so Casey, I'm going to move over to plant growth. We had some questions about cycle times and light intensity as it relates to DLI. So let's start with the study that you referenced. And so we had some questions about increasing light intensity and the effect on the plant quality if you saw bleaching, or how did you determine that you were at the light saturation point? So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So I'll kind of answer this question in a few different parts. To discuss the phenomenon of light bleaching, that is a very interesting one that we all really are studying right now, and how this is achieved. And we didn't really traditionally see that when dealing with single-ended HPS bulbs as we did when we started moving into these higher intensity lights like double-endeds or the high intensity LED lights. So this is kind of a slight newer thing, newer meaning 5 to 6 years in how we're studying it. And essentially the challenging part is that what we're seeing is that the actual photo bleaching itself isn't changing much as far as the chemical composition of the flower, cannabinoids and terpenes, the growth rate of the flower. It seems to be a saturation in the chlorophyll, right? And this is definitely a little bit more scientific talk to go with this. And we're actually running some trials right now where we're purposely fully bleaching plants and studying the mineral contents within those plants, studying the diversities within the plants to try and achieve the understanding of at what point do plants actually start bleaching and lose their chlorophyll production. The next point is also a challenge. With cannabis, the cannabis species is so diverse and it comes from so many different backgrounds, right? And a plant that is optimally grown in a dense canopy within, let's say, Panama or Thailand is going to have a completely different set of requirements from a plant that is grown in a more arid region like Afghanistan or Pakistan, right? So what optimally produces that plant compared to the other might be slightly different compared to in its genetic makeup and background. And so what I recommend is if you have cultivars right now that you're unfamiliar with as far as the light levels of intensities, just experiment with those. Push 1, push 2, push 3 of them, change certain things, but do it one at a time, right? You got to change one variable at a time. That's how people have issues sometimes with changing too many variables. So change one variable at a time and check your genetic. Go through the entire process and see if it elevated your production or if it elevated your chemical content at all. And at that point, document that and try and replicate that.
Okay, thank you, Casey. One question about the environmental conditions in these studies as you are manipulating DLI. Can you talk a little bit about CO2 levels? And are you manipulating those CO2 levels as you adjust your light scheduling?
Absolutely. So CO2 levels, elevating CO2 levels and elevating light levels, as we've seen, are pretty synergistic, right? And there is no specific relative formula to say, if I increase light by this much percent, I will also need to increase carbon dioxide by this much percent. because it really depends on the rest of your environmental conditions, what the temperature is, what the humidity is, you know, how rapid those plants are growing. There's a lot of factors that will also come into play when we're talking about, you know, comparing CO2 or parts per million of CO2 to light. And so generally, you know, we put an average CO2 rate at, you know, 14 or 1500 parts per million at higher light intensities, you know, around 1000 micromoles or more. And that seems to be generally, like I said, adequate for most species of cannabis, right? As we go down into our vegetative phase, obviously lower light requirements, lower CO2 requirements. But then again, it really depends on the genetics of your plant and how that plant itself is being produced, right? And how it's interacting with the light source as well as the CO2 source. But they both do respond in a linear curve. It's just not exactly a 1% to 1%.
Thank you. All right, so I have some technical questions, Casey, regarding DLI and light saturation again. So this one's specific from Felix. I'm going to ask, at what light intensity do you usually observe photosystem 2 damage or deactivation? So what peak levels should be avoided?
That's a very great question. And that is one that if we knew, we would have our top cap, essentially. And we've noticed different expressions in different cultivars and different species of plants, right? And the same thing within cannabis and hemp. We've noticed that different cultivars will respond differently to the light intensities, right? Some may reach a light saturation point a lot faster than others. To reference, at one of my farms, I was growing a lot of landrace varieties. And I had a Panama red variety that would not produce anything if I moved my light level over about 900 ppfd. No matter how much extra CO2 I gave it, no matter how much extra water and mineral nutrients I gave it, that plant peaked out when I gave it a treatment of about 900 ppfd of light. And so what that told me is that the genetic limitation might have been reached right there. And every plant has a genetic limitation. And right now, to say that there is a baseline standard limitation for all cannabis crops, we're not there yet. We don't quite know that because we are continuing to push the envelope on a lot of different varieties of plants in very, very high ppfd values that previously would never have been met before. And so now we're able to actually study these higher light levels and understand physiologically what's actually happening into the plant. And so I hope within the next few years, we'll be able to come up with a little bit more concrete values of minimums and maximums to share with everybody.
Let's talk about that. There have been some questions about research and asking about the optimal light intensity or the optimal environment. And so we know, as we've been in this industry for a few years now, that genetics plays a big role in this conversation and the limitations that we have with research and what we're allowed to do. So can you talk about as a grower, and when you were growing before, what were some things that you took into consideration for genetics as you were conducting this kind of research?
Well, I'm kind of a data nerd, and I go down as many wormholes as I possibly can into things a little too far. And so the first thing that I do is I research that genetic and I research that cultivar and trying to understand what parental lineages went into that cultivar, right? That way I can get kind of a history into the background of what I may expect. Then what I do is, obviously there's a lot of internet resources out there. I look around and ask people that are growing and cultivating similar cultivars or by similar parental lineages what they see, right? One of the tough things with cannabis cultivation right now is that genetics are bred by a specific person using a specific method for a reason, right? And they're selecting and crossing their varieties based on what they are utilizing. And so a genetic that might have been developed in a greenhouse or an outdoor field might respond completely differently indoors with artificial lighting, with a controlled system. And so understanding how those genetics were actually bred and selected is also a really important thing. The next step is to start out small. Start out small and pay attention, right? And within doing this, keeping things consistent is very important, right? And so to say, okay, I think that adding more light to this specific variety might increase my yield, right? So then I set up a specific parameter and test around proving that theory, right? And I do it very small. And then the next time I change one parameter, test that through, then change another parameter and test that through. And so we all have the capability of maintaining our own research. It's just, where do we start? What are we trying to find? And how do we conclude the results? That's really important. And so understanding the genetic makeup, the genetic background, and gathering as much information will give you the foundation of what you need to actually begin your research and understanding the capabilities. Elise, are there any more questions? So I'm not hearing anybody right now, but I guess one thing that I would like to, oh, I can hear you, Elise, are you there?
Hi, Casey. You guys, this whole internet situation just kicked me right off. But I'm back, and I can still see all of your questions. So where did we leave off?
I just finished answering that last question.
Oh, fabulous. Okay, great. All right.
Hopefully everyone heard it.
Yeah, I was a little hit or miss there, but I think I'm back fully now. Okay, great. So there were some more questions around DLI. One of them was talking about minimum and maximum of DLI. So I'm going to ask a specific question. What is the optimal or maximum DLI on the higher side that we should be using for flowering cannabis instead of on the lower side around 800?
Right, and that is the kind of million-dollar question right now that we are doing a lot of research to try and understand a little bit more thoroughly. We have definitely in some of our research crops been pushing, past 50, past 55 DLI and seeing excellent results. But then again, it really is genetic and system dependent. So right now we really don't have a maximum. There's a maximum that we've seen in certain situations based on certain cultivars as well as environmental conditions, but we really don't have a general maximum yet, which actually could be a good thing, but really it's the fact that understanding as we go, you want to always find the maximum minimum, right? If you're giving the plant more light than it's actually utilizing, you're wasting resources and wasting money, right? So we want to give the plant the most for as little as it needs, right? And this will achieve a couple things. It'll achieve obviously optimal growth, but it'll also minimize the amount of resources that you feel you need to achieve those results.
Thanks, Casey. And can you maybe point out some traits so as you go tell your growers here, hey, go test it out, go check it out on your genetics, make sure you're optimizing your environment. What are some physical traits that they should be looking out for in their plant that might be signs of saturation or photoprotein?
Right. So if we're doing a test where we're increasing our photon density or the amount of DLI or PPFD that we're giving to our plant surface, we obviously start at the level that we understand. So let's say we measure our canopy and we're normally at 800. And I want to see if adding 1,000 is going to, add to my production or consistency, right? So what I do is I add 1,000, move it up to 1,000 and see, and this is why it's better to do it in a small example, because you don't want to do this on your entire production run, because then you're betting on the fact that this experiment is going to work for you. And we can never expect the fact that our experiments are going to work. We're learning information from our experiments to implement on the next phase, right? So start small, add that parts per million, right? Or add that PPFD, right? Don't change anything else yet. Then go through that entire growth phase. observing the plant, measuring the plant, looking at the trichome densities, measuring the internodal spacing of the plant, all the values that we can record. Then we produce the crop, we harvest the crop, and we analyze the crop. So then it gives us our wet weights, our dry weights, our premium flowers to extract ratio, as well as our chemical composition. So how many cannabinoids, total cannabinoids, and how many terpenes were based out of that experiment, right? And then after we evaluate, we look at both of those options and say, okay, what happened? Did I increase anything? And can I increase more, right? So then we push it to the next level. And then we push it to the next level, right? But only adding one thing at a time. If that next level didn't produce anything, then we can change another variable, like introducing more parts per million of CO2 or more feed into the schedule, right? But if you add 3 different variables at the same time and change 3 different parameters, you have no idea at the end of the experiment which one of those parameters or how they combine to create that successful situation. So doing it very small, a few plants at a time, in a smaller area, and changing one variable at a time will really show you the analytical data that you'll need to know whether that experiment or that treatment actually was effective.
Thanks, Casey. That's really helpful. So I'm going to turn to some questions that have been asked about the cycle time. And so I know that parts of this presentation we're talking about how to manipulate your cycle time. Can you please explain how to shorten or lengthen cycle time within DLI?
Right, and so this is also another very good question, and this is a question that we as researchers are continually exploring. And basically, it boils down to, when it comes down to plant production, if it don't make dollars, then it don't make sense, right? And if you can't quantify doing something, right, based on the amount of hours and energy that it takes the employees to do it, responses to the system, any extra additives that we have to put in it, if it doesn't equate to more revenue or more production, then it's not worth doing, right? And so there is really no specific formula to say that with a sour diesel per se, that if I give it, an hour here of this treatment, an hour here of this treatment, a day of this treatment, that it's going to equate to the same thing in someone else's garden, right? So we're doing a lot of experiments with differentiating these time frames from the standard 12s to 18s, as well as doing things like nighttime interruptions, daylight extensions, different things, right? But nothing yet that is extremely quantifiable to say that if you use this in this scenario with this exact genetic, and not meaning I have a sour diesel, you have a sour diesel, the exact same genetic, then we don't really know how that is going to equate to our success. And so boiling it back down to the fact that if it's not worth it in the production with the amount that you gain out of it, then it's not worth doing. We as cannabis growers like to expand a lot of different concepts and ideas, which is great. But when it comes down to it, if it doesn't increase our revenue exponentially in a way to where we can quantify the amount of time and energy that it takes to perform that function, then it is not worth using that function. So whether that's anything from changing the light intensity and time frames of the lights to adding specific components to our feed programs or optimization programs, if it doesn't make dollars, then it doesn't make sense.
Okay, great. Thanks, Casey. I have some questions here about the types of technology and the types of lighting. And so there are lots of ways we can go about this, but they're asking about LED versus HPS versus HID and being able to manipulate the lighting over the period of time. Can you talk a little bit about technology and the use of this technology?
Right, absolutely. And this is one thing an area that I absolutely really love is the control, right? Unless we're growing outdoors in a field where we really have minimal control over what happens to our plants in an environmental standpoint, right? We've built a greenhouse and we've built our indoor facility to maintain that optimal level of control, right? The challenge that we see with a lot of equipment is the lack of ability to control. And this comes from adaptations of equipment from other industries that weren't created to produce plants or to produce what we are trying to produce with that piece of equipment. So HVAC, lighting, there's a lot of components to cannabis production that wasn't originally designed and developed for cannabis production, that we've just been adapting to it, right? And so the more we have control over our individual key components to our system, and lighting and HVAC are two of our absolute key components to the system. If either of those systems fail or have a challenge, there is zero production in the plant, right? And so these two key components of the system, you want to be able to have the utmost control and ability to manipulate every aspect of that, right? Or as many aspects as you can, right? So the difference one of the main differences besides, spectrum and obviously all these other things compared from LED to HID lighting is that ability to control. When we're utilizing the LED technology, I can go from 5 ppfd to 1,000 ppfd and not change the quality of the spectrum, not change anything other than that exact intensity, right? And it changes on the linear curve. So now let's say on the flip side, if I were to try and do that, manipulate an HID spectrum. So let's use a high pressure sodium, a double-ended high pressure sodium as the example, right? Yes, I can minimize the amount, make it a 400 watt from 1,000 watt, or make it a 600 watt from 1,000 watt. But what I'm also doing is manipulating the spectrum that it was designed for, as well as the electrical capacity, the efficiency of the fixture itself. And so what we have utilized is an adaptive piece of mechanical equipment into our program that we can only slightly change and manipulate compared to the LED that we can ramp up and ramp down our light intensity all we want without changing any of the other parameters and components of how that fixture was made.
Thank you, Casey. And one of the questions from a user here is, sorry, I'm going to pull this up. Are there ways to change DLI outside of adding or subtracting lights or changing light height indoors?
Absolutely. So DLI is really light intensity mixed with time frame, right? So anytime you manipulate one or the other or both of those, it will change that DLI value. And so lowering our lights will raise the intensity of that photon density on that plant, right? Which will elevate that DLI. So say we're staying with a 12-hour, just to kind of reference it, we're in a bloom phase and we're sticking with a 12-hour, but I want to elevate my DLI, right? So if I lower my fixtures, but yet still maintaining a consistent light level across the canopy, if I'm able to achieve that and I lower my fixtures closer to the canopy, I'm going to elevate that intensity that I'm actually deploying on the canopy, right? In combination with the amount of time that I'm utilizing those fixtures for, and that will elevate my DLI as well too. So there are certain things that you can do within your program to manipulate that DLI level, which is either changing the light intensity itself or the time frame at which those lights are actually providing photons to the plants.
And Casey, when you are adjusting DLI and setting up a research setup based on genetics and environmental conditions, someone has a question here. Could DLI modify the taste of your products or the chemical composition of your products here?
Absolutely. And the reason why is because your plants, like I said before, your plants are accumulating what is being given to them and continually responding to them, right? And so if your plant is continually not getting an adequate amount of some source that it needs to succeed in its physiological production, then it is going to lack in all the capacities, in the cannabinoid and terpene production, in the plant and flower production, in the health, strength, and rigidity of the plant. Those will all be diminished, as well as the opposite. If you are paying more attention to all of those things, you can develop better plant structure, which also develops plant better flower structure and density and colors, which absolutely also encompasses the secondary metabolites or terpene and cannabinoid production as well. So yes, absolutely. Everything correlates to that quality of flower that you're going to try to achieve for your success.
Great. And so in greenhouse applications, I have a question from Stuart. He's asking, to supplement the shortfalls of light during a day, are there any practices about luminaires for daylight harvesting methods? So, dimming according to the natural light and adjusting there. Can you talk about technology there?
If I think I'm hearing the question the right way, but with that control, with that comes the ability of control, right? And so if we're trying to match and manipulate our supplemental lighting to kind of correspond with what's naturally happening in the environment, which is that sunrise, sunset, moving from one hemisphere, the light moving from one side to the other side, we can achieve that utilizing the control as well with LEDs. And so I hope I answered that question correctly, but you can definitely manipulate that utilizing the control in a greenhouse if you want to closely match that sun, but yet just add to the intensity. That's the benefit of utilizing a technology that's really adaptable.
Thanks, Casey. I think that helps. And we can use that time to transition from cultivation conversation to technology. And so we have some questions about light meters and the types of tools to use from a variety of different applications. So from home growers, they're asking budget-friendly par meter recommendations. And from larger growers, it seems we're asking about, what are some of the things that you should look for in a light meter technology as you're evaluating all the different types of product on the market?
Right. No, that's a great question. And really, the baseline is your budget. We only have so much to work with, and you got to work within your means, right? That being said, getting the most for your money is important. Doing the research is really important. But there's a lot of different companies out there actually making light sensors. There's a few that are really good. Like I mentioned before, if you want something that has been tried and tested in the agriculture community for years, you're looking at something, in the Lycor or the Apogee range, right? Now, if you need something a little bit more economical, right, to start out with, to start getting yourself familiar with taking light readings, Sun System has an inexpensive one. Hydrofarm has an inexpensive one. There's a few on the market that are really similar to each other, that are within the $50 to $100 price range, that you can start getting, familiar with actually recording light levels. So what I say with a tool is, a tool may be off, right? And a tool may be calibrated slightly different than another tool. But as long as that tool is consistent, and we understand how it compares to a tool that is accurate, then it's okay. So, if you don't have quite the money to get yourself, $1,000 Lycor and you buy a less expensive Sun System one, maybe find someone that does have a Lycor meter so you can base it off of that and say, generally, my meter is about 100 ppfd off. But as long as it's consistent, that's really what we're looking for. And that's the challenge sometimes that we have with tools, is finding a tool that is actually consistent every time we use it.
Great, thanks, Casey. So we have about 3 more minutes left at the top of the hour. So I'm going to close the question and answer session for now. There are some outstanding questions, so thank you guys for participating. What I'll say is the presentation will be posted on our events page website on Friday. And on our events page on our website, you'll also be able to see what upcoming webinar topics will be presented as they're scheduled. And if you follow us on our social media channels, we will also keep you up to date on webinar topics that we are scheduling through the month of April, May, June, July. If you guys have additional questions, please feel free to send those questions through our social channels or through our email. I see that there are quite a few questions here about different types of light quality, UVA, UVB, broad spectrum, and its impact on THC and chemical production. And so what I'll say to that is, please keep sending those questions in so that we can create new content and be providing you with webinar topics related to those specific topics. So we do have a research team that will be posting and hosting some presentations as well. So keep sending those in. And thank you all very much for tuning in to this webinar series. We hope you have a lovely day and happy growing.
And wash your hands.
Oh, I'm washing it. Thanks, Casey.